Windemere's Paperback Saloon. A short story. The narrator remembers the golden age of Melbourne's bookstores. No violent thrill or transport of exaltation can compare to the gentle pleasure of sifting through the musty stacks in Windemere's Paperback Saloon, back before the industry succumbed to vulgarity from abroad. Nestled between a hotel and a modest skyscraper, Windemere's was the epitome of a lost time, an era when Melbourne bristled with bookstores, pedestrian and esoteric. The Enchanted Mole, the curliest children's book supplier in the Southern Hemisphere, was perhaps the most famous. But Windemere's was, for those with a sense of adventure, unmatched. The manager, Terry, a pimply apparition in flared pinstripes, but with a prodigious knowledge of non-fiction imprints, could prance across the turquoise shag pile. "Have we got a treasure for you this time?" he'd say, clutching you by the arm, complete with the lisp of authenticity, and dragging you off behind the floral curtain to a copy of Fran Bossinger Pringle's greatly misunderstood expose of 19th century rose breeders, the limited edition. "Probably the only copy in the country," he'd say. Or he might surprise you with a bombshell, like Tony Crispwin's saucy Life of Lenin. These were new arrivals, but the stock on the shelves were just as good. Old Mrs. Windemere was an enthusiast, but had faulty business sense. Over the years she had filled the store with dusty obscura, precious volumes little known. It's said that her son, Rusty, who managed all the money, and once played football for Essendon, would have sold it all without hesitation if he hadn't feared her fierce reprisals. It was in fact her hobby. When she was taken to her bed, never to recover, she appointed the begoggled Mrs. Churleyberg, an ex-librarian, to hold the fort. She, however, suddenly confronted the bottom line and had to hold a sale. Fantastic authors, Jan Spanner, H.P. Lovesong, Nigel of the Nile, John Fosdyke, thick ones, went for a spare coin just to clear the hallways of the accumulated debris. But even this was to no avail. Mrs. Windemere's legacy lingered on. Years after she'd gone, you could still amble in from the Flinders Street entrance, avoiding the rabble at the hotel door, and pick up a long-lost thriller over lunch. The crime section was outstanding. Everything from Aaron Alexander to Zygorski's trilogy of grisly homicides, set against the background of adultery and double-dealing among international financiers in Prague. They once had a book signing with D.P. Harold, the author of The Cypress Parchment and other gripping mysteries. You could shake his hand and ask him if his characters were really based on members of the royal family, as they said in the reviews. They also scheduled Penny Holmes, who never showed. 6 months before it was revealed she was a man collecting fan mail under false pretenses. There was a famous skirmish with her publisher. Terry was just an assistant at the time, but Mrs. Churleyberg was on leave visiting her sister in New Zealand. The publisher's representative, Perry Simplesmith, who advocated American methods, threatened to revoke their sale or return. In response, Terry threatened to boycott their other titles. The standoff made the news. Eventually, Rusty intervened, considering the impasse a bloody nuisance. There was an apology in writing. Terry taped it to the window for the customers to see. Second best after Windemere's was, without question, the Mid-City Book Emporium, popularly the MBE. This tiny little oasis of good taste, jammed between a sandwich shop and a shoe store at the far end of the arcade, couldn't compete when it came to the fast genres, but for idle purchases like a cookbook, it was just the place. The only surprise was the penchant of the proprietor, Malcolm Straightways, for early travel books and tales of British conquest. The British campaigns in Hindustan were his speciality. There was a handsome glass class of treasured titles in the bottom corner. On rainy days you could sit on the bench provided and ask Mel for a careful peruse of Langley's classic Road to Bangalore, black bound on rice paper with copious engravings. Poor Mel would be carried off with customers looking for a book on puddings. He would have preferred taking you through the full history of the Raj, with asides about the exploits of his uncle Clive, the second Clive of India, as he'd say. Often at lunchtimes, women would attempt to bring their big blue baby strollers in, and the browsers at the back would find themselves trapped with nowhere to go but reference. Mel would have to stand up on a crate and call for attention. "Excuse me, ladies, please. I know it's an inconvenience, but could you leave your strollers outside the store?" Some women would object. The truth is, Mel had packed more juicy titles into his tiny nook of the arcade than the space could reasonably handle. The best time to drop in was early morning. It was less crowded. Then you could appreciate the depth and breadth of the selection. It was possible some mornings to find 3 or 4 titles you thought you'd never see, except in surface mail catalogues from Canada. For spiritual nourishment, the place to go in that era was the Candlemas Bible Repository beneath the Masonic Hall on the hill in Little Collins. The building has since been demolished, and the Presbyterians have sold the remnants of what was once a thriving business to an online magazine distributor from Asia. Walking by now, you have no idea of the original architecture, nor of the parade of quite famous people, scholars, bishops, poets, who would take advantage of the repository's quiet below-street ambience and its fascinating array of diverse Judeo-Christian literature. All denominations were represented, except Catholics. It was a place of meditation and sometimes of intellectual ferment. It is said that the once influential right-wing Southern Christian Alliance, that would today be called a think tank, started as a heated debate in the Just Released section when a block of prominent Anglican customers, each of whom just happened to be there that day, took issue with Edmund Fudgewent's pioneering book on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Others report that the infamous Archbishop Long, the pirate of St. Philip's, who resigned for reasons of ill health in a scandal in 1949, shocking his flock, was given the finger when confronted by church accountants in the Pauline Epistle Room. Ecclesiastical wits larked that Long had taken refuge in Paul's doctrine of freedom from the law. For many years the CBR was run by Stephen Wilde, a retired army veteran and lay preacher, and consequently, during his reign, it specialised in historical works, biographies and the like, on the Australian Army chaplaincy. Following Wilde's death, the store was managed by a husband-wife team, Gordon and Lydia Greystanes, with a background of missionary work in New Guinea. The tenor of the store changed. It became more outlooking, more cosmopolitan, more conscious of the wider world, the church's mission to the common man. The Greystanes installed a whole wall of the Everyman Library, a personal favourite, and a lavish selection of sacred writ in the vernacular tongue. The store began to deteriorate after an incident in 1974 when a large inquisitive Labrador followed a customer in and set off a new fire sprinkler system causing extensive water damage. The stock was underinsured and the enterprise was scaled back to a mediocre selection of devotional works, audio cassettes and greeting cards. For fine works, an open fire and the highest standard of service, though at a price beyond the range of most, you could also drop into Laura Cousins on the second floor of the Smith Building on Elizabeth Street. This was a store with old-world ostentation, announced by the ornate brass doorknobs. Before the war they had served sherry to their clientele, but later they merely provided leather chairs, free newspapers, and occasionally a lunchtime violinist. It was an old establishment, but not well known beyond its own class of person. It is said that D.H. Lawrence berated the store in a 3-page letter still unpublished. The writer's wife, Frida, during their brief visit to Australia, claimed the store gypped her of £2.20. The supposed letter, rumour says, remains in the possession of the Cousins family, although they no longer have anything to do with the store. Sometimes you could find a bargain. Every 6 months or so, a new shipment of quite inexpensive editions of Hardy and Dickens might arrive, or the novels of Florence Sedge. Every now and then you might pick up volumes of verse beautifully bound for somewhat less than you expected. In any case, the demeanour of the staff always left you feeling that it is quite inappropriate to quibble over pennies. There was no visible register or even a cash drawer. To make a purchase, you presented the book along with ample notes and made no mention of price. At length, the assistant returned from a back room with change and receipt, and talk of the splendid volume now in your possession. A more democratic readership was to be found just around the corner at Randall's. This was a sub-news agency and so catered for punters after daily race guides. But further from the street you encountered a good display of popular works. The real pleasure here, though, was as a place to bump into people you knew. The area around the fiction shelves, further defined by a row of penguins, functioned as a popular standing room where you could meet other avid readers and chat about a new release or the sorry state of the weather. Faces would reappear day after day. The same gentleman in the brown coat, the short banker, the woman with the argumentative hairdo. Eventually, either you or they would say hello, and then a week later offer an exchange of names. Then, some days, as you walked in, it would be nods of afternoon, 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 to a dozen familiar faces. And one would come over and say, "I see you like Dennis Prentice. He's got a new one out, you know." Strange to relate, several years ago there was a radio program on the BBC on how wedded couples had met, and a happy couple rang in to explain that their paths had first crossed at Randall's, Melbourne, Australia, 20 years before, standing by the author's A to Z. They joked that they were both looking for romance on the wrong side of the shelf. Before the television bans were extended, when the written word still lubricated the social mind, Randall's was as much a part of the hum and crush of the windy streets as the Marathon Cappuccino House, or, in an earlier time, the bar at the King Edward Hotel. Apart from these lingering establishments, the period also saw a generous variety of excellent but short-lived undertakings that filled the gaps and catered to arcane tastes. You might mingle with the avant-garde at Both Ends Books, that had as its emblem a candle burning from 2 wicks. The concept was for a bookshop that would open late and satisfy the city's community of night owls. Or you could overhear cryptic conversations full of verbal paradoxes about Matisse and D.P. Milkwood's play for voices at the Beyond the Pale, where the assistant wore a top hat and spoke in urgent whispers. For collectibles and such like, you could visit, for a time, Miss Green's on Upper Russell and spend an hour among the coin catalogues or the supporting tomes of history, ancient and modern. For classics, you could go to Father Pliny's on Flinders Lane, where even the subject categories and notices to customers were written in Virgil's Latin. These specialty stores came and went, like the city's first legal purveyors of erotica, the Hill of Consent, not far from Parliament House. For a time, bohemian types and long hairs would congregate at the nattily named One Earth Wonder, incongruous near the Treasury Exchange. The manager, Kevin, was a refugee from Western Australia and had a portrait of Trotsky in his office. The enterprise didn't survive the simple savageries of capitalism, however. There was no market for the lentil revolution, and among Melbourne's lost and displaced, the subculture was all sub and no culture. It was a place for layabouts and comic freaks, and even worse, sci-fi enthusiasts. The only real competition Windemere's had ever faced, the 2 Bob Book Room, had been closed for years, or at least its doors were shut. You could walk past, and often the lights were on. The owner, Bob Normandy, secretly specialised in the sordid occultist Oliver Haddo, the ultimate Englishman, and the books and pamphlets of his cabal of Masonic scribblers. Mrs. Normandy had regular correspondence. The store closed to the public when it was revealed Bob was really Jacob Silverklink, a man curious with German connections. The wires were still hot from the war. A timid bedragglement of intellectuals met there on Melbourne's brown and dreary eve to taste the first-class esoterica, the works of Ronnie Goonan and Frithjof Smith, Titus Burkhouse, Ananda Chandra and the Lord of North Kent, the only copies the south side of the equator of such dangerous thinkers. Only Burkhouse's handsome coffee table account of the architecture of the Mussulman leaked beyond this circle. I was standing outside the 2 Bob book room once, observing that the doors were shut, but the lights were on all the same. A man came up to me and said, "I hear they only cater to selected clientele, by appointment." "A pity," I said. He agreed and admitted that for many years he had rustled paperbacks worth reading there, and the prices were always soft-covered, and Bob himself was a cascade of exotic publishing information and smiles. Needless to say, this era has ended. The creamy brown brickwork is largely replaced with glass and steel. It is as if a whole epoch of history has intervened. The checkouts came, and more the shelves were filled with non-book items. Young people turned to the music stores, old people to the lottery. Windemere's was absorbed by a large cartel. Terry got a job in Sydney. Florence Sedge disappeared into obscurity. The clouds in Randall's moved on. Malcolm, like Milkwood, died of ale, and it transpired that Edmund Fudgewent had, after all, written his archaeological reports without once leaving his office at Oxford. Now there are impressive skyscrapers actually scraping the sky, as the grey clouds and brown haze hang low together, and bright orange advertising signs that, even as you fly into Tullamarine for the first time in 30 years, seem three-dimensional, visible marks of an eagerness to be new. "It looks just like Ohio," says the businessman next to you, from the air. He points to the new bridge, an arch of lights. The construction company almost bought his range of safety gear. But you'd rather not make conversation. In your hands is an old, tattered copy of Boris Charlesworth's Captives of Rage, a saga built around Crimea. Charlesworth was a journalist with a florid but engaging style. It is the warmth of its pages you want, though, the feel of paper on your fingers, not its tangled narrative of ambitious captains and their bells. You found it on the bottom of a stack in Windemere's on a bitter winter's day, a day it hailed like golf balls throughout the afternoon. You took it home, reading it on the tram as high school girls jostled for a seat, and at home you read it by the coal heater until nodding off to sleep, absorbed in the lush panorama of history. It sold well in its day and won favourable reviews, and in fact, as the plane hits the tarmac, you think of the weakness of the characters and the transparent imitations of Turgenev, and decide it's not as compelling as you recall. But at the instant, it's the weight of the book in the hand that is important. On the inside cover is Windemere's Paperback Saloon, and the price, Imperial, and a phone number that is just a recorded message.